Al-Bakir Alafi Mukhtar, who is the director of the Khatim Center for Peace and Human Development in Khartoum. Before that, he took this on in 2006, but before that, and when I first heard of him, he was a senior fellow with the U.S. Institute of Peace. Before that, he worked for Amnesty International as a regional campaign coordinator for Middle East and North Africa. Several scholarly works can be attributed to him, books in Arabic on human rights in Islamic discourse, and Betting on Knowledge, Human Rights Education in Middle East and North Africa. He has a master's degree in linguistics from Aston University in Birmingham, and a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from Manchester University. Our second speaker is Toby Howard, who is here. He's a desk officer in the UN's Department of Peacekeeping Operations, currently working in the Asia-Middle East Division. But he's definitely not here today as the voice of the UN. He's speaking in a personal capacity, given the fact that he has immense experience working in the Africa Division on UNMISS matters, UN mission in Sudan. And before that, he has 3 African peacekeeping missions under his belt, being Western Sahara, DRC Congo, and Eritrea Ethiopia borders. He has a degree in Arabic and International Relations from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And our third speaker is Gerald Martone, who is Director of Humanitarian Affairs at the International Rescue Committee's headquarters here in New York. For the last 10 years, before he took on this assignment, Jerry Martone was rarely in New York because he was the director of the emergency response operations and the first person to go out to assess the needs when there were crises and determine how the IRC could best contribute. So in that capacity, he oversaw emergency operations and assessments. Burundi, Liberia, Kosovo, it's going to take a while. Chechnya, Congo, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, East Timor, Uganda, Albania, Bosnia, Angola, Ethiopia, Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq, tsunami affected Indonesia. We'll stop here because Jerry teaches as a adjunct professor here at our school and published far too many articles and chapters to mention on a whole range of issues of international aid. The fourth speaker, whom you'll find in the program, Nicola Reindorp, is unfortunately a victim of the humanitarian syndrome that you can never quite be sure where you're going to be the next day. And Nicola, unfortunately, had to rush off and can't be with us today, but she's with us in spirit. So I'd like to start with Al-Bakir, and then we'll...
Thank you very much, Dick. Well, the question here is there any peace to keep? And to answer this question directly, I would say there is no peace to keep. But there are vulnerable people in urgent need of protection. The AU military presence has little impact on the security situation. The AU force is small, underfunded, with limited mandate, and easy to outmaneuver, if not to manipulate, by the government of Sudan. It cannot protect the people of Darfur, even if the mandate allows that. Indeed, the government army and its supporting militias carried out attacks against civilians using the AU's vehicle color to camouflage its helicopters while carrying attacks against civilians. The AU even failed to condemn this treacherous act, which puts the credibility of the AU as an institution on the line and risks the lives of its soldiers in Darfur. In spite of the presence of the AU forces, the security situation is deteriorating, and the humanitarian crisis is intensifying. Tom Arnold, chief executive of Concern Worldwide, has recently warned that unless key political decisions involving the government, the Darfurian rebel groups, and the international community are urgently taken, there will be a huge long-term human tragedy. Retired General Usman Abdullah was a former Minister of Defense during the transitional period in 1986 and member of a national committee headed by Suwar Dahab, the president of the Transitional Higher Military Council in 1985-1986. The committee they formed a committee that they called the National Committee for aligning the position of the nation, meaning the government and the opposition. The committee's declared aim is to unify the stance of the government and the opposition parties towards Darfur in order to reach a national consensus. This committee formed a delegate to visit Darfur in order to have first-hand information about the situation. Upon their return to Khartoum, General Usman Abdullah has said, quote, "What we have seen is far worse than is reflected in the Western media. Now I am convinced that a UN peacekeeping force is urgently needed in Darfur. Any delay will mean a disaster." The committee was silenced after it raised its report to the government. So, the prescription to avoid this pending disaster is clear. Decisive international action to protect the defenseless people of Darfur and to improve the security in the short term and to start a meaningful long-term peace process. Both measures are scandalously missing at the moment. The government in Khartoum, or rather the ruling National Congress Party, NCP, is taking advantage of the international apathy, disunity, and inaction. The NCP defined the victims of Darfur, that is the Zurga tribes, as the enemy and set out to destroy them. It is the responsibility of the international community to protect these people. The longer-term solution is to work towards a new comprehensive peace process, one that learns the lessons of the Darfur Peace Agreement, DPA. The point of departure of this effort is to admit that the DPA is crippled beyond repair. It is almost dead now, an expected outcome of a defective process. I don't want to get into why the DPA not only has failed to make peace, but has actually led to more conflict and an increase in violence, death, and displacement. There is a lot of literature on that. What I want to stress here is that we are in urgent need for a new strategic approach to deal with the problem, an approach that learns the lessons of the failure of the DPA, as well as the lessons of the success of the CPA. Such an approach should be based on the following: A, an accurate analysis of the nature of the problem; B, an accurate analysis of the nature of the ruling party, NCP; and C, an effort to unify the Darfurian rebels; D, an effort to unify the stance of the international community; E, show of resolve by the international community. In what follows, I will tackle the nature of the problem and the nature of the regime. The nature of the problem: one of the failings of the DPA is that it did not capture the nature of the problem, which is rooted in identity. The issue of identity and institutional racism is not addressed by the agreement. We know that Islamism and Arab centricism represent the core values of the regime. Indeed, these core values represent the main driver of the ruling class throughout the history of post-independent Sudan. The current regime only pushed those core values to their logical conclusions and toned down the veil that previously disguised them. The ruling class perceived itself as racially and culturally superior and looked down upon the marginalized people as inferior to them on all counts. I have argued in another place that the cultural, political, and economic marginalization is a result rather than a cause of the war. In other words, marginalization is a conscious policy laid down and executed by the northern ruling class on the basis of its definition of its own identity and its perception of the identity of the marginalized people. Whereas the DPA tried to tackle the political and economic marginalization, it left the cultural marginalization untouched. For instance, the DPA admits that the number of schools in Darfur is scandalously few and speaks about addressing this imbalance. But it is silent about the content of education provided in these schools. The educational policy has always been decided by the northern ruling class, and the content of the curriculum is designed according to its outlook. The core of the educational aim was to emphasize elements of the northern identity, that is, Arabic language, northern way of life, the Arabs' history in Sudan, history and geography of the Arab world, and Islam. The curriculum is therefore designed to produce two categories of graduates. On the one hand, it produces in the Riverian North a person who feels that he or she is an Arab and therefore racially and culturally superior to the others who share the country with him or her, especially those whom he or she defines as black Africans. In other words, it produces a young person who is aware of his or her place at the top of the racial hierarchy and is able to rank the rest under him or her accordingly. On the other hand, it produces from the other regions, such as Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, a person who is alienated from his or her culture and people, and who has been socialized to want to be a northerner. Students from this second category are made to feel inferior to the northerners in every respect, economically, socially, culturally, linguistically, and even in their accent. Intellectuals from Darfur, such as Abdullah Usman Al-Tom and Sharif Harir, tells us of their own experience with this curriculum and its impact in damaging the psychology of the young Darfurians. The curriculum, aided by the mainstream culture and media, is therefore designed to produce two types of people, dominant and dominated. Harir tells us that by the end of the secondary education, that is just before university education, the children in Darfur end up with a near total alienation from their local cultures. Understandably, when these young people come to Khartoum for university education, their alienation becomes complete and their inferiority becomes visible to them. They see themselves through the revelation of the northern world and measure their souls by a tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, to use Du Bois' expression. So, also identity is mentioned by the participants of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government forum who rightly agreed that any solution must take into account the Sudan's identity issues and the crimes perpetrated in identity's name. The DPA failed to do that. There is a disease and there are symptoms. Although the disease is in the center of power in Khartoum, the symptoms appear in the margin, whereas the war zones are found in the south, the east, the Nuba Mountains, southern Blue Nile, and Darfur. The war-making machine is found in the center of power in Khartoum. Dealing with the war zones in a piecemeal fashion is akin to treating the symptoms while neglecting the disease itself. The NCP would want to deal with each region separately and to treat the symptoms rather than addressing the root cause of the civil war, because doing that will affect their grip in power. Then, the nature of the regime. It is crucial to understand the nature of the regime in order to deal with it effectively. The regime is created and run by a dogmatic, violent, and repressive group who worships power and is determined to keep it at any cost. The only language that they listen to is the language of force and violence. They know no reason and no logic. They despise those who advocate reason and non-violent means. They only respect people with guns. The bigger your gun is, the more respectable you are. Constructive engagement without credible threat of force does not work. It never worked in the past and will never work in the future. The regime's policy in the south is a great lesson, is a great learning lesson. They mobilized all the resources of the country to wipe out the SPLA, SPLM, and to dominate the south by sheer force. For so many years, the head of the regime made pledges that that particular year would witness the end of the rebellion in the south. They applied their strategy of divide and rule in the south with initial success and used every trick in the book to keep the south divided. They rejected every proposition by the IGAD initially, but they swallowed it after some time when the pressure becomes unbearable. They concluded the CPA only when the SPLM were able to overcome its division, unify its gun and voice, and only when the IGAD, backed by the international community, also became unified and spoke with one voice, and only when they realized that the price of not reaching an agreement was higher than the price of peace. In other words, it is only the SPLA's gun coupled with the credible outside pressure that brought the regime to the negotiating table crying and kicking. In the same manner, unless the Darfur rebels are unified, and unless the international community speaks with one voice, and unless the international effort is backed by a credible threat, the regime is not going to heed any calls for peace. Chinese and Russian vested interests in Sudan should not blind them of the plight of the people of Darfur. These two countries should use their leverage to influence the regime to cooperate with the international community, not to view the big contracts as a bribe by the regime to buy their support. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay. Is there a piece to keep?
Is there a piece to keep? Thank you, sir. Yes, I'd just like to reiterate what Professor Salomon said at the beginning, that I am here in my personal capacity. I do have a job to do that I would like to go back to after this conference. So anything that I say is, I would, as I say, please, I'm speaking in my personal capacity here. I want to basically just talk a little bit about what the Department of Peacekeeping Operations has been doing basically since 2004, since we became very much involved in the planning for the peace process. First of all, the north-south peace process, and then latterly on Darfur. My main remarks are going to be based towards the CPA because that is my area of expertise, but I will try to cover a little bit on the east and on Darfur towards the end. I came on board working for DPK at the beginning of 2004, just after the Security Council had given us a presidential statement in October 2003, asking the Secretary General to examine how best the UN could assist the parties to the North-South peace negotiations implement their final agreement. This PRST, this presidential statement, put in motion the UN's planning processes. And how we started out, we had sort of weekly meetings, all members of the UN community meeting together. And as we focused, while we were focusing on the Naivasha talks at the beginning of 2004, at that early stage, our planning for that peace process increasingly became overshadowed by the unfolding events in Darfur. And we began to really find ourselves facing a moral dilemma, because here we were planning to put a large number of troops into the south of the country where there was already a fragile peace, while at the same time another part of the country was facing intolerable violence that some people, even then at that early stages, were calling genocide. First of all, in the south, is there peace to keep? Yes, there is a peace to keep in the south. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement signed in January 2005 is a hugely complex, intricate document that came together after years of deliberations that sets out in some detail not just a deal between North and South, but a blueprint for how the entire country should be governed over a 6-year interim period, and then leading to a self-determination referendum in 2011. In practice, it has become increasingly a deal between those two north-south parties, as other parties have been shut out. But primarily the deal that was done in Naivasha was a deal between two visionary leaders, Ali Othman Taha and John Garang, who had developed an incredible strong personal chemistry during those long talks. And they worked out considerable detail about the CPA that others, major leaders, including Salva Kiir, were not privy to, which brought the CPA into some trouble once Garang was later killed in the helicopter accident. But let me just focus on the military role of the peace agreement, the role given to the United Nations. The CPA sets out for the UN a very clear, precise roles for a UN peacekeeping force. It creates a ladder of key monitoring and verification bodies, defines clear tasks where the UN works with both the parties involved to ensure that the parties redeploy, go to their assembly areas, and also work on technical assistance for disarmament exercises, DDR exercises. At the same time, the Council expanded these areas in its Resolution 1590, which established the UN mission in Sudan, talking about asking us also to look into monitoring of other armed groups, provision of security to IDPs in the areas of our deployment, as well as the usual provision that most peacekeeping missions get these days. It's called, some people call it Chapter 6.5, where we are asked to protect civilians under an immediate threat within the areas of our deployment and the capabilities of our deployment, without, of course, prejudice to the government's overall responsibility to protect its citizens. So in the south of Sudan, UNMISS had an invitation from both parties to play a clearly defined Chapter 6 primarily role on the ground. So putting this another way, the UN had the consent of the parties to deploy and help to implement the agreement. That same consent, as much of the debate over the last year has involved, is not the same in Darfur. We do not have any consent from the government yet to deploy a UN peacekeeping force to Darfur. In the south, we deployed a force of 10,000 military, just under 10,000 military. Whereas this number may sound a large number, when you break it down and you look at the areas involved, it's not that big. We have 750 unarmed observers. We have 5,000 troops who are involved in enabling units. These are engineering and transport companies, medical units, hospitals, support to air and maritime assets, some mining companies, and movement control. Of the 10,000, only about 4,000 are actual infantrymen to defend our presence, defend the UN presence, and as well as the usual role to defend civilians under imminent threat. But within this area, we have huge areas in which to operate. Sector 1, Equatoria province, is the size of the country of Austria. We have 700 Bangladeshi military guarding our about 10 or 12 different installations and facilities throughout that area. Sector 2 is the size of New York State. The force has been pretty hard-pressed at times to provide the various protection to our assets as well as civilians under imminent threat when they had been called to do so, but largely the mission in the south has been quite successful. The types of security threats that it faces are quite daunting. Although there is a peace to keep, although there is an agreement, a good agreement between the parties, the various types of insecurity are huge and numerous. There are different other armed groups, armed militias, that split from the SPLM way back in the early 1990s and have been used by the government, as other speakers have mentioned, to divide and rule over the last decade and a half before peace was signed. These different other armed groups are still armed by the Sudanese armed forces, or elements of the Sudanese armed forces, I should say. And although there has been an attempt to integrate and amalgamate them